In part 1 of my rebuttal to Richard Gage's 9/11 controlled demolition video, Blueprint for Truth, I listed a number of reasons why the scientific evidence refutes his position. In part 2, we'll begin to investigate the 10 ways that Richard says the tower collapses show controlled demolition and ask, are they true? We'll also add to the 44 reasons we already have for why the Twin Towers were probably not a controlled demolition. He has very compelling arguments, as I've said before, and 1,500 architects and engineers have signed on to his cause as well. Against them are hundreds of scientists at NIST, several major universities, thousands of trained scientists who completely disagree with Richard Gage. Rather than wait for the government to open up a new investigation, we'll do our own little investigation right here and now. We'll see if the technical truths support his theory. We'll cover these assertions in more detail in later chapters of this video. But here are Richard's 10 reasons why these building collapses were like a classic controlled demolition. Richard Gage is telling you what to look for and then showing you slides and videos with a compelling narrative to convince you that you are seeing those 10 things. Throughout this video, I will be asking if these claims are true, one at a time. Here are Richard's 10 claims and some very brief introductory rebuttals. 1. Sudden onset of destruction at the base of the building. Well, destruction began 80 stories up, inside a fire zone where controlled demolition is impossible. 2. Straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprints. All 3 buildings fell into their weakest points and scattered debris non-symmetrically over 16 acres. 3. Demolition waves remove column support. Rapid removal of column support happens in controlled demolitions, but in a natural collapse, the failure of one column shifts the load to other columns at the speed of sound. 4. Free fall through the path of greatest resistance. The Twin Towers fell at only 2/3 of free fall and encountered significant resistance on their way down. And most buildings do not collapse at free fall when they're demolished anyway. 5. Total dismemberment of the steel structure so it's loaded and ready for shipping. The debris pile does not show total dismemberment at all. Then, minimal damage to adjacent structures. The Twin Tower collapses triggered huge multiple fires and billions of dollars in damage to nearby buildings. Sounds and flashes of explosions, and that's true, and we'll compare the explosive sounds of controlled demolitions to the sounds of the Twin Towers collapsing soon. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. This is also true, and it happens in both natural collapse and controlled demolition. Isolated explosive ejections 20 to 40 stories below the demolition front. Well, the squibs from the Twin Towers are caused by air pressure and are random, unlike the patterned squibs from controlled demolitions. And finally, chemical evidence of cutter charges. These claims have not been proven, as we will see. There are some ways in which the collapse of the 3 World Trade Center buildings look like controlled demolition, and some ways that it does not. So we will have to look more closely at the evidence. Let's start with Richard Gage himself, who said near the end of Blueprint for Truth, these collapses show, quote, all the features of a classic controlled demolition with those exceptions which are atypical of classic or controlled demolition. So even he agrees that these collapses have only some of the telltale signs of controlled demolition. So let's compare the collapses with what we know about classic controlled demolition. By definition, these were not controlled demolitions. If they were controlled demolition, then all the variables would be isolated to have control over precisely when and where these explosions happen to trigger a collapse. Variables like plane crashes, massive fires, 40,000 workers watching holes being drilled into their office walls, worried New Yorkers working 24/7 in these buildings and hearing tapping sounds, strong smells of welding torches for controlled demolition preparation. All these are not the hallmarks of controlled demolition. I did not find one worker report of suspicious activity. Not one controlled demolition firm has said it would be possible to carry out a controlled demolition with all of this activity and all these variables. Even former controlled demolition employee Tom Sullivan, a rare person in the business who believes this was a controlled demolition, told me, not getting this critical timing right results in a hung structure, meaning floors and entire sections do not collapse but rather pile up. It is very hard indeed to get these buildings down in a controlled manner under the best of circumstances when everything is studied and indeed controlled. A classic controlled demolition is usually preceded by very loud explosions and a logical pattern of squibs. How does a classical controlled demolition sound? Here is the rumbling first of the World Trade Center tower. Here is the soundtrack so you can hear the difference in sounds, something Richard Gage rarely does. Here is a classic controlled demolition. Noise. Big explosions at the base. Squibs blowing out before the collapse begins in a logical, organized pattern. Not at all random. You can see the explosive knocking out the core and all the supporting structures at once. Richard Gage claims that the Twin Towers were brought down in a deceptive, controlled demolition, so the explosive sounds would be masked through the use of very hot explosive nanothermites, which he claims caused massive dust clouds and multi-ton objects to fly hundreds of feet across the plaza. Well, unfortunately, he can't have it both ways. Any demolition with 30 to 60 tons of explosive nanothermites would create enormous fireballs and shockwaves strong enough to visibly compress water vapor from the atmosphere. It would create deafening 140 decibel sounds a half mile away. It would be witnessed by hundreds of thousands of people. If it was a quieter, heat-based, thermate-created demolition, it could not possibly have caused these ejections. Only 6 companies in the world can bring down tall buildings. They all dismiss this theory. They can't tear down the world's tallest buildings in secret in an entirely new way while a raging fire is going on, tossing in 2 crashing 767s to randomize the structural damage and make the feat even more virtuosic. So far, I've given a total of 54 reasons favoring natural collapse. Richard Gage's 10 reasons for controlled demolition are all highly suspect at best. Near the beginning of our March 6, 2011 debate, I started with an invitation to be open, to listen carefully and then to decide. In that debate, Richard's rhetoric set up a trap to slam the mind of his audience shut over a single debating point, saying if I don't explain several things to his satisfaction, then the debate is over. I offered dozens of carefully researched, clearly explained reasons for natural collapse, inviting the audience to suspend judgment and decide at the end where the weight of the evidence lies. Here's a very brief review of Richard's "the debate is over" rhetoric. The melting of steel girders, or the debate is over. Well, 2 steel beams showed high temperature sulfur corrosion, but that's not enough to explain a global collapse. That sulfidized steel, quote, melted at 1740 degrees, 1,000 degrees lower than pure steel and within the temperature range of a normal building fire. Several tons of molten steel or iron in the debris pile of all 3 buildings, or the debate is over. Well, the debris pile showed abundant aluminum, and indeed there were also several tons of melted aluminum discolored by debris, with a melting point of only 1,200 degrees, not nearly enough to melt steel. The billions of previously molten iron microspheres, or the debate is over. In the 70s, workers welded thousands of steel beams and splattered microspheres. We'll say more about these later. The red-gray chips of advanced energetic nanothermitic composite material found in the World Trade Center dust, or the debate is over. This has not been proven for me, but the jury is still out on this assertion, and we will see when we investigate this further in another section of the presentation. The symmetrical freefall collapse of Building 7, or the debate is over. Since 9/11, there has been a symmetrical, very fast collapse due to a fire of a tall, steel-framed building into its own footprint. It took place in 2008. I have the video, and I will prove this in a later section of this video. In the course of this video, I will meet all 5 of Richard's rhetorical challenges with credible, carefully researched answers. I will also visit his 10 reasons for controlled demolition and investigate them in much greater detail. In our March 6, 2011 debate, Richard left dozens and dozens of my assertions unanswered. He tries to shift the burden of proof onto me, and I voluntarily accepted it. But Carl Sagan once said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. The reality is that, fair or unfair, the burden of proof in the scientific community is on Richard. He has made an extraordinary claim, but has yet to produce extraordinary proof.